Adolf Hitler was born on April 20, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, a small town on the border between Austria and Germany. His father, Alois Hitler, worked as a customs official, while his mother, Clara Pölzl, was a homemaker. Hitler's childhood took place in an environment marked by his father's strict discipline, with whom he had constant conflicts over his future. Alois wanted his son to pursue an administrative career, but Adolf dreamed of becoming an artist. During his youth in Linz, Hitler grew increasingly distant from conventional studies. He showed little interest in school subjects and preferred to spend his time drawing and painting. After his father's death in 1903, his relationship with his mother became closer. Clara supported his artistic ambitions, but her fragile health and lack of resources limited the young man's opportunities. In 1907, Hitler attempted to enter the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, but he was rejected twice due to his poor skill in architectural drawing. His stay in Vienna was a turning point. He lived in shelters for destitute men and survived by selling watercolors on the streets. During these years, he absorbed political and racial ideas circulating in the Austro-Hungarian capital. The city was filled with anti-Semitic propaganda, including newspapers and pamphlets blaming Jews for social and cultural decline. Hitler read these publications attentively and began to form a hostile view toward them. According to testimonies from his friend August Kubizek, Hitler already expressed intense hatred toward Jews, whom he saw as responsible for the loss of Vienna's Germanic character. During this period, his life was marked by frustration. Rejected by the academy and without steady employment, he found emotional refuge in politics. Nationalist and racial ideas offered him a simple explanation for his personal failures: the belief that Jews controlled the economy and the arts, preventing Germans from succeeding. This idea, reinforced by propaganda from nationalist groups such as the Pan-Germans, became the core of his ideology. In 1913, Hitler moved to Munich to avoid mandatory military service in Austria, which he despised for being a decaying multinational empire. Munich, with its ultra-nationalist atmosphere, consolidated his ideas. The mixture of social resentment, personal failure, and exposure to extremist rhetoric shaped the foundation of the anti-Semitism he would later develop in his political career. World War I changed his destiny. He volunteered for the German army and served as a messenger on the Western Front. He was wounded and decorated for bravery, but Germany's defeat in 1918 left him devastated. Like many veterans, he believed that the surrender had been an internal betrayal. He embraced the idea of the internal enemy, identifying Jews and Marxists as responsible for the defeat. After the war, Hitler remained in the army and worked as a political informant. In 1919, he joined the German Workers' Party, the precursor of the Nazi Party. His incendiary speeches, full of anti-Semitism and nationalism, quickly made him stand out. In a letter written that same year, he described his vision of the Jews as a racial tuberculosis that had to be eradicated. The years of youth in Vienna and Munich were key to his ideology. There, he found justification for his hatred, turning personal experiences into a radical political discourse. His failure as an artist, poverty, and the xenophobic atmosphere pushed him to seek an enemy to blame for his misfortunes. This narrative became the core of his later propaganda. The cultural environment in Vienna was full of anti-Semitism disguised as nationalism. Politicians like Karl Lueger, the city's mayor, used hatred toward Jews to gain popular support. Hitler observed how these leaders mobilized the masses with simple, emotional speeches. He would later use this learning to shape his own oratory style. In Munich, his contact with ex-soldiers and paramilitary groups reinforced his vision of a violent and exclusionary future. For him, the war had proven the need for a disciplined society without elements he considered corrupt or inferior. In his mind, Jews represented that threat which had to be eliminated to restore Germany's greatness. Hitler's racial hatred did not arise suddenly. It was the result of a combination of personal failures, cultural influences, and racial theories popular in Central Europe. Every rejection, every humiliation in Vienna, and every speech heard in Munich strengthened his belief that Jews were the obstacle to his ambitions and to the country's future. The figure of August Kubizek is essential to understanding those years. He was Hitler's closest friend in Linz and Vienna and left detailed accounts of his character. Kubizek described a passionate young man obsessed with grand projects and with an increasingly radical view of the world. In their conversations, Hitler already expressed open disdain for Jews and admiration for strong, authoritarian leaders. During this time, he was also drawn to ideas of racial superiority. Theories about blood purity and social Darwinism were in fashion, and Hitler adopted them as absolute truths. He believed that history was a struggle between races and that survival depended on eliminating the weakest. The extreme poverty he experienced in Vienna deepened his resentment. Surrounded by Jewish immigrants from the East, he interpreted his own misery as the result of an economic and cultural conspiracy. This vision solidified in later years when he began to write his ideas and spread them in political rallies. In conclusion, Hitler's childhood and youth were the ground where his racial hatred took root. The experiences he lived in Linz, Vienna and Munich, combined with Germany's defeat in World War I, shaped an ideology that would mark history. Every stage of his life before coming to power was shaped by a learning of hatred and an obsession with finding someone to blame. Anti-Semitism in Vienna and Munich. Adolf Hitler's stay in Vienna coincided with a period in which anti-Semitism was part of political and cultural life. The streets were filled with propaganda that blamed Jews for the alleged decline of the city. Hitler, who had arrived seeking a career as an artist, found himself in a society divided between supporters of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germanophile nationalist movements. These political currents used hatred toward Jews as a tool to gain support. Vienna had a strong presence of sensationalist press that spread anti-Jewish messages. Newspapers like the Deutsches Volksblatt published articles portraying Jews as a threat to German culture. Hitler, who spent hours in libraries and cafes reading such publications, absorbed these messages until they became part of his thinking. He observed Jewish merchants, saw them succeeding in businesses he could not access, and associated his own failures with a conspiracy against him. During these years, he learned about the theories of Karl Lueger, the mayor of Vienna, who used anti-Semitic speeches to mobilize the population. Lueger presented Jews as responsible for political corruption and economic dominance in the city. Hitler admired his ability to connect with the masses through simple and direct phrases. This model inspired him to adopt a similar style in his future political speeches. Poverty and life in shelters increased his resentment. He shared space with Eastern European Jewish immigrants fleeing pogroms in Russia and Poland. Their presence in poor neighborhoods reinforced the idea that Jews were an invasive community, different in customs and religion. This perception, fueled by propaganda and his personal experiences, led him to form a deeper hatred. In Munich, the situation was different but equally intense. The city had become a center of political unrest after World War I. Nationalist, paramilitary, and ultra-conservative movements found common ground in anti-Semitism. Hitler became part of this environment when he moved there in 1913. He attended meetings in beer halls where Germany's defeats were discussed, and Jews and communists were blamed for the crisis. The post-war period was fertile ground for racial hatred. The Weimar Republic, with its cultural modernity, was seen as a symbol of decadence by the most conservative sectors. In Munich, this perception intensified with the brief Bavarian Soviet Republic, which in 1919 was led by Jewish origin leaders. For Hitler, this was proof that Jews were responsible for the communist revolution and political instability. The combination of propaganda, economic crisis, and racial theories solidified his vision. Hitler attended speeches by agitators like Dietrich Eckart, who became his political mentor. Eckart taught him to transform his resentment into a political narrative based on hatred. In these meetings, Hitler refined his oratory, using aggressive language that captured the audience's attention. In letters from this time, Hitler described Jews as a race and not as a religious community. He compared them to a disease that weakened nations, an idea he would later repeat in his speeches. This extreme language became a central part of his ideology. Contact with ultranationalist groups in Munich showed him how anti-Semitism could be used to gain mass support. He observed that by pointing to a common enemy, leaders could mobilize crowds without offering concrete solutions. Hitler adopted this strategy and took it to the highest level when he assumed leadership of the National Socialist Party. The cultural climate of Vienna and Munich offered racial theories wrapped in pseudoscience that spoke of blood purity and Aryan superiority. Writers like Houston Stewart Chamberlain were read in nationalist circles, and their books defended the idea that Germans descended from a superior race destined to dominate Europe. Hitler read these texts and interpreted them as confirmation of his prejudices. Poverty and failures in Vienna had planted the seed of hatred. In Munich, with military experience and the radical political atmosphere, that seed grew into a full ideology. Hitler found in antisemitism a simple explanation for social and personal problems. This narrative, which merged racial hatred with nationalism, became the foundation of his public speeches. The influence of figures like Eckart and other members of nationalist circles was decisive. They taught him that political success depended on identifying a visible enemy and attacking it relentlessly. Hitler applied this lesson with an intensity that even surprised his early followers. The cities of Vienna and Munich were ideological laboratories for Hitler. In them, he learned to combine cultural, economic, and racial elements into a unified vision of hatred. Every personal failure, every observation in poor neighborhoods, and every speech he heard reinforced his idea that Jews were the obstacle to his success and to German greatness. Anti-Semitism in these cities was not marginal, but a current accepted by many sectors of society. Conservative and nationalist parties used this discourse to gain popular support. Hitler knew how to take advantage of this climate and turn it into a political tool. From the streets of Vienna and the meetings in Munich emerged the core of the ideology that would later bring him to power. Anti-Semitism in Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf was written by Adolf Hitler during his imprisonment after the failed Munich coup of 1923. In this work, he combined personal memories with a political vision centered on hatred toward Jews and communism. For Hitler, both ideologies represented enemy forces that sought to destroy Germany. From the first pages, he made it clear that he viewed Jews as a race, not a religion, which, according to his logic, justified radical measures against them. In the book, Hitler adopted conspiratorial ideas spread by Alfred Rosenberg and other racial theorists. He believed that Jews were responsible for both exploitative capitalism and Bolshevism. This association allowed him to present a common enemy behind all political and social crises. His argument was simple. Germany could only reach its true potential if it eliminated Jewish influence and was governed by Aryan Germans of pure blood. Mein Kampf explained that history was a constant struggle between races. According to Hitler, strong peoples survived by eliminating the weak, and Germans had a duty to dominate to ensure their existence. This idea, influenced by social Darwinism, became the foundation of his racial policy. In the book, he claimed that racial mixing weakened nations and that only racial purity guaranteed the strength of the Reich. The text insisted that Jews were a foreign body within Germany. Hitler described them as corruptors of culture, promoters of ideologies contrary to the Germanic spirit, and responsible for Germany's defeat in World War I. He argued that they had undermined the army's will to fight and manipulated the economy during the conflict. This narrative was reinforced with baseless accusations, but very effective as propaganda. In Mein Kampf, Hitler also linked his anti-Semitism with the need for territorial expansion. He presented the idea of Lebensraum, or living space, arguing that Germany had to conquer eastern territories to secure resources and land for its population. According to him, this expansion meant confronting both Slavs and Jews, whom he considered inferior races. This geopolitical vision justified not only war but also extermination as part of an inevitable racial struggle. The work was widely disseminated after its publication. Although its sales were initially low, once Hitler came to power it became a mandatory text. Every German couple who married received a copy as a gift, and millions of copies were distributed throughout Germany. However, many bought the book just to show loyalty to the regime without reading it in depth. Even so, its messages penetrated society through Nazi propaganda and political indoctrination. In the content of Mein Kampf, there are chapters dedicated to his life in Vienna and Munich, where he described how his anti-Jewish view was formed through personal experiences. He claimed to have opened his eyes to the Jewish problem upon seeing the presence of Jewish immigrants in Vienna, whom he accused of controlling key sectors of the economy and the arts. This narrative reinforced the idea that his hatred was not political but a natural conclusion of his observations, though in reality it was shaped by prejudice and propaganda. The structure of the book also reflected his propaganda strategy. Hitler understood that the public responded better to direct and repeated messages. He used short, emotionally charged phrases seeking to persuade through impact rather than complex reasoning. This style would be the same he adopted in his speeches and that characterized the Nazi Party in its mass campaigns. In addition to his hatred toward Jews, Mein Kampf proposed an authoritarian vision of society. Hitler harshly criticized the Weimar parliamentary democracy, considering it weak and corrupt. He argued that only strong leadership based on racial principles could save Germany. In this context, Jews were presented as the main obstacle to achieving national unity and strength. The influence of Mein Kampf was enormous. It not only served as an ideological guide for the Nazi Party, but also laid the groundwork for the systematic persecution of the Jews. The ideas expressed within it were implemented through laws such as the Nuremberg Laws, which defined who was considered Jewish and restricted their rights. The entire legal and repressive apparatus of the regime found its justification in the words written in this book. Hitler insisted that the struggle against the Jews was not a personal matter but a question of survival for the German people. This narrative, repeated both in the book and in his speeches, sought to rally the population around a common enemy. The success of this strategy became evident when antisemitism shifted from being a fringe idea to becoming official state policy. The combination of autobiography and political doctrine in Mein Kampf was key to its impact. Hitler recounted his personal experiences, such as his frustration in Vienna, to lend credibility to his worldview. At the same time, he outlined his plan to transform Germany into a powerful and racially pure nation. This plan included the elimination of the Jews, presenting it as an inevitable measure to protect the country. The anti-Semitism of Mein Kampf was not just an opinion, but a declaration of intent. Within its pages, Hitler announced what would later become a brutal reality: the persecution and extermination of millions. Those who read the book carefully could see the foundations of the Holocaust years before it happened. The moral degeneration of Weimar attributed to the Jews. The Weimar Republic was born amidst military defeat and political crisis. From the beginning, conservative and nationalist sectors viewed it as a weak regime, corrupted by foreign and cultural influences. In this climate, Jews were portrayed as responsible for a supposed moral decline that, according to Nazi propaganda, affected Berlin and other cities. Prostitution, pornography, cabaret culture, and the rise of avant-garde movements were directly linked to Jewish presence. Urban life in Berlin, full of cabarets and nighttime entertainment, became the perfect symbol for Nazi propaganda. National Socialist leaders claimed that this modern culture was the work of Jewish elements seeking to destroy traditional German values. This message resonated with conservative segments of society, who viewed with suspicion the social changes, freedom of expression, and growing visibility of communities such as the homosexual population. The Nazis used images of the German capital to reinforce the idea that the country was in the hands of corrupt interests. Joseph Goebbels, a propaganda expert, described Berlin as a nest of degeneration dominated by Jewish businessmen and artists. This narrative portrayed Jews not only as economic enemies, but also as a cultural threat undermining the morality of the German people. Prostitution was another theme exploited by propaganda. Jewish women were blamed for the sex trade in major cities, although there was no real data to support these claims. Sensationalist press amplified this image with headlines linking crimes and scandals to alleged Jewish businesses. These stories helped reinforce the perception that Jews were behind every corrupt aspect of urban life. Pornography, which was becoming more openly distributed, was used as another example of Weimar's decadence. The Nazis claimed this material was produced and spread by Jewish-run companies with the aim of weakening German youth. This moralistic discourse served to gain support among conservative families and religious groups. Homosexuality, which gained more visibility during the 1920s in Berlin, was also demonized. The Nazis alleged that Jews were behind the promotion of unnatural relationships, and that this was part of a conspiracy to destroy the Aryan race. Organizations like Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute of Sexology, run by a Jewish doctor, were attacked and burned down by Nazi paramilitary groups such as the SA. Cinema and theater, two sectors where many Jewish artists worked, were singled out as instruments of cultural corruption. Films depicting sexual freedom or questioning traditional values were described as Jewish poison for German society. Goebbels launched campaigns to boycott these productions and promote a national cinema that exalted the German spirit. Propaganda was not limited to printed media. Conferences, rallies, and exhibitions were organized, featuring posters and manipulated photographs to reinforce the message of the Jewish threat. These activities aimed to convince the population that the country's morals were at risk and that the only solution was to eliminate Jewish influence. The rise of recreational drugs in some Berlin circles was also used as an argument. Nazis claimed that Jews were linked to drug trafficking and that this was part of their plan to corrupt German youth. This idea was repeated in pamphlets and speeches, although it lacked any factual basis. Cultural antisemitism was not confined to large cities. In provinces and smaller towns, Nazis spread the message that everything modern and foreign was the work of the Jews. This discourse resonated with a population suffering from unemployment and inflation. The idea of an internal enemy responsible for the loss of values was easy to accept. Changes in the role of women in society were also used as an anti-Jewish argument. Women who worked outside the home, dressed modernly, or participated in artistic activities were associated with the cultural corruption driven by Jews. This narrative reinforced a traditional model of womanhood, submissive and homebound, opposed to the modern woman, who, according to the Nazis, was a threat. The propaganda strategy aimed to simplify all social problems into a single explanation: Jewish influence. Thus, diverse phenomena such as unemployment, drug use, cultural shifts, and modernity were presented as part of the same conspiracy. This allowed any crisis to be blamed on a common enemy. The Weimar Republic, with its cultural openness and social experiments, was turned by Nazism into the perfect example of what needed to be destroyed. Hitler's speeches repeated that the country had been contaminated by a Jewish elite seeking to weaken Germany from within. This idea was reinforced with laws and measures that restricted Jewish participation in cultural and economic life. The attack on Jewish culture was a preliminary step toward social and economic exclusion. Before deportations or extermination were discussed, the Nazi regime had already convinced much of the population that Jews were responsible for the country's decline. This process began with cultural and moral demonization, which paved the way for more extreme policies. Nightlife, artistic modernity, and social diversity in Weimar were used as symbols of a common enemy. The Nazis built a narrative that transformed Germany's cultural richness into alleged evidence of corruption. This propaganda, repeated endlessly, succeeded in shaping public opinion. The Jew as a usurious banker and cause of inflation. Nazi propaganda portrayed Jews as responsible for the economic crisis that struck Germany after World War I. During the hyperinflation of 1923, millions of Germans saw their savings disappear overnight. In this context, the image of the Jewish banker was used as a symbol of speculation and enrichment at the expense of the German people. The Nazis claimed that Jewish financial elites controlled international banking and manipulated markets to bring the country to ruin. This accusation was repeated in pamphlets, newspapers, and speeches. Hitler and leaders like Heinrich Himmler pointed to Jewish bankers as the culprits of the financial collapse, convincing the population that there was a global economic conspiracy against Germany. The resentment toward Jews was not based on real data, but on historical stereotypes. Since the Middle Ages, Jews had been permitted to lend money when other religions forbade it, leading to the image of the Jew as a greedy moneylender. This perception persisted for centuries and was reinforced by the economic hardships of Weimar. Many Germans, losing homes or jobs, sought visible scapegoats, and the Nazis provided an easy answer: blame the Jews. The crisis of the German mark was devastating. Within weeks, money lost its value, and people needed suitcases full of bills to buy bread. The Nazis exploited this desperation, claiming that Jewish bankers had caused the inflation to profit from speculation. Although the real causes were far more complex, including war reparations and government economic policy, propaganda simplified the issue and linked it to a concrete enemy. The figure of the usurious banker was central in propaganda posters. Grotesque drawings showed Jews with exaggerated features holding bags of money while German families went hungry. These visual messages were easy to understand and generated deep hatred. Joseph Goebbels, as propaganda chief, knew that an image could have more impact than any rational explanation. In speeches, Hitler spoke of the need to free Germany from the clutches of Jewish capital. He linked financial speculation to the destruction of the national economy. According to him, while the people worked and suffered, Jews amassed wealth from banks and department stores. This message was repeated constantly to implant the idea that the country's problems had a single culprit. Economic anti-Semitism was not limited to banking. The Nazis also accused Jews of controlling commerce, the textile industry, and other key areas of the economy. Manipulated statistics were circulated to prove that a Jewish minority dominated strategic sectors, although the reality was different. This kind of propaganda aimed to convince people that Jews were not mere competitors, but a threat to national survival. The economic crisis after the Great Depression of 1929 reinforced this discourse. Massive unemployment and poverty made Hitler's promises attractive. He promised to expel the Jewish parasites from the economy and return jobs to the German people. This message of hatred was one of the keys to the rise of the Nazi Party. Anti-Semitic propaganda used real data, such as the presence of Jewish entrepreneurs in some sectors, but distorted them to present an exaggerated and negative image. Jewish families who had prospered in the cities were portrayed as guilty of the suffering of the German middle and working classes. This narrative turned envy into hatred. Police reports of the time reflected that in many cities it was believed that the government had handed over the country to the Jews. In Bavaria, for example, rumors of pogroms were recorded due to economic discontent. This atmosphere of tension was exploited by groups like the SA, who attacked Jewish businesses under the pretext of defending the German population. The Nazi view was that financial capital and communism were two sides of the same Jewish conspiracy. Hitler claimed that both Wall Street bankers and Soviet leaders were working toward the same goal, the destruction of Germany. This theory, although absurd, was effective in uniting his followers against a common enemy. The confiscation of Jewish property was one of the first economic measures of the Nazi regime after it came to power in 1933. With discriminatory laws, Jewish businesses were forced to be sold at minimal prices, benefiting Aryan German businessmen. This looting was justified with the idea of freeing the economy from the corrupting Jewish influence. Images of wealthy Jews contrasted with stories of poor Jews, further fueling hatred. The Nazis claimed that Jews, whether rich or poor, were always a threat. If rich, they exploited the people. If poor, they were criminals or parasites. In this way, there was no escape from demonization. The Jewish banker narrative was integrated into school textbooks and Nazi education. Children learned from an early age that Germany's economic problems were the fault of an enemy minority. This hatred-based education prepared new generations to accept discrimination and violence. The Weimar economic crisis was real, but anti-Semitism turned it into a political tool. Hitler knew how to capitalize on popular discontent by pointing to a clear enemy and offering a radical solution to expel Jews from economic life. This idea, repeated thousands of times, eventually took root in millions of people looking for a quick way out of their problems. Forced expulsion as the first real policy. From the moment Hitler took power in 1933, the plan was to push German Jews to leave the country. Not yet through extermination laws, but through daily rules and abuses that left them with no options. First, they were stripped of their jobs in public offices. Then the doors of schools, universities and professions like law, medicine and teaching were closed to them. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 erased their citizenship and turned Jews into foreigners in their own country. Each new regulation further reduced their chances of living normally. They could not own businesses. They could not marry non-Jews. They were not even allowed to sit in certain parks. They were made to feel unwanted. The idea behind all this was to drive everyone out without yet resorting to open violence. Between 1933 and 1938, nearly 150,000 Jews managed to leave. But leaving Germany was not easy. They had to pay special taxes, and neighboring countries began to close their borders. In 1938, with the annexation of Austria, the number of Jews under Nazi control suddenly increased. Vienna had a large Jewish community. There, Adolf Eichmann opened an office to organize forced emigration. Jews were stripped of everything and given papers to leave. If they couldn't pay, they were pressured until they signed whatever was demanded. The method became a model. In Berlin, in 1939, the Central Office for Jewish Emigration was created. The goal was to empty Germany of Jews through bureaucracy and threats. Reinhard Heydrich and Eichmann were in charge. They claimed it was voluntary, but it was a lie. If people did not cooperate, they lost everything. Violence escalated with the Night of Broken Glass in November 1938. In one night, synagogues were destroyed, shop windows smashed, and 30,000 men arrested. After that, thousands realized they could no longer stay. The regime imposed an atonement tax on the Jewish community for the damages. In addition, their bank accounts were frozen. To leave the country, they had to give up almost all their belongings. It was theft disguised as paperwork. The Evian Conference in July 1938 showed that no country wanted to take them. Delegates from over 30 nations met, but almost all made excuses. Only the Dominican Republic offered to accept a few thousand. The Nazis took this as proof that the world didn't want the Jews either. Hitler said that if other nations didn't want them, then Germany didn't have to accept them either. This was used to justify pushing them out at any cost. By 1939, before the war began, the regime realized that expelling millions was not easy. There were not enough countries willing to take them. Foreign embassies were overwhelmed with applications. Many Jews ended up trapped between borders. The emigration plan had a limit. Only those who could afford it could leave. The rest were trapped. That's why the authorities began to look for faster and more radical solutions. Up to that point, the official policy was still to force Jews out. Eichmann worked on a plan to remove all Jews from Europe. He even dreamed of sending them to Madagascar. Meanwhile, in Prague, Vienna, and Berlin, thousands were interrogated, stripped of their property, and driven to flee. By the end of 1939, about 300,000 Jews had left the territories controlled by the Reich, but many more remained. With the invasion of Poland, the number skyrocketed. The war changed everything. Border closures, the occupation of new territories, and international isolation left the Jews with no escape. What had begun as pressure to emigrate became confinement, and from there the next step was mass deportation. The policy of expulsion was not a humanitarian gesture. It was the first step in a plan of racial cleansing. It wasn't just about removing Jews. It was about robbing, humiliating, and pushing them to the limit until they were left utterly alone. With every border closed, every visa denied, and every bank account frozen, the idea of mass emigration became impossible, and the Nazi leaders knew it. By 1940, the phase of expulsion was coming to an end. What followed was far worse. The deportation plans to Madagascar. In 1940, after the German victory over France, the Nazi leaders began seriously considering a massive solution to remove Jews from Europe. The idea of deporting them to the island of Madagascar, a French colony in the Indian Ocean, emerged as a territorial alternative to what they called the Jewish question. This proposal was promoted by Heinrich Himmler with the backing of Adolf Hitler and was presented as a way to isolate the entire Jewish population from the European continent. The plan was based on the assumption that Great Britain would be defeated and that the British merchant fleet would fall into Germany's hands. With those ships, the Nazi regime believed it could transport millions of Jews to the island. The victory in France and access to the French colonial empire reinforced the illusion that this massive deportation was feasible. However, this idea, although attractive to the Nazis, was unrealistic due to Madagascar's geographical and logistical conditions. The administration of the plan was entrusted to Franz Rademacher, head of the Jewish department in the German Foreign Ministry. Rademacher drafted a detailed scheme that aimed to relocate between 4 and 5 million Jews over the course of 4 years. To finance the operation, a special bank was to be created to manage the assets confiscated from Jews across Europe, using these funds to pay for transportation and settlement on the island. Rademacher also had the support of Reinhard Heydrich, who, as head of the Reich Main Security Office, RSHA, would oversee all aspects of the plan: transport, administration and security. Heydrich viewed Madagascar as a super ghetto, a place where Jews would be monitored by German police and have no direct contact with the outside world. Although there was talk of granting them some internal autonomy, in practice they would live under a strict police regime. By mid-1940, Adolf Eichmann, along with Dannecker, developed a detailed draft of the Madagascar project. This document included maps, tables, and a deportation schedule. The plan called for sending 1 million Jews per year, starting with those in territories under German control. Jews would be gathered in camps before being boarded, and their administration would be supervised by the SS. The idea of deporting Jews to Madagascar was not new. Before the war, governments like Poland or France had explored the feasibility of resettling Jewish communities on that island. Even the Lepecki Commission, sent by Poland in 1937, had studied the climatic and agricultural conditions of the area, concluding that only a few thousand families could survive there. Despite these reports, the Nazis revived the idea with a much more ambitious and brutal goal. By the end of July 1940, Hans Frank, Governor-General of occupied Poland, was informed of this plan. Construction of ghettos in cities like Warsaw was temporarily halted because it was expected that all Jews would be deported to Madagascar after the war. This news quickly spread among local administrations, creating the belief that the Jewish problem would be resolved by a massive expulsion abroad. However, the plan began to fall apart with the Luftwaffe's failure in the Battle of Britain. The inability to defeat Great Britain meant that the merchant fleet needed to transport millions of people would not be available. By September 1940, the project was stalled, although it was still mentioned in internal documents until the end of that year. Eichmann continued to speak of a transoceanic evacuation as a long-term solution, but in practice the Madagascar plan was fading. The project revealed the genocidal mentality of Nazi leaders. Although systematic extermination was not yet openly mentioned, deporting millions of Jews to a hostile island would have resulted in extremely high mortality. For the Nazi hierarchy, this was not a problem, but a natural consequence of their policy of segregation and racial hatred. The Madagascar Plan was an intermediate step between the policies of forced emigration and the so-called final solution. It reflected the desire to isolate and destroy Jewish life in Europe, even under the appearance of relocation. The transition from this idea to extermination camps occurred when war made any mass deportation abroad impossible, and Nazi authorities chose more direct and lethal methods. The search for a territorial solution in Poland or Siberia, with the failure of the Madagascar Plan, Nazi leaders turned their attention to the occupied territories in the east. The invasion of Poland in 1939 and the subsequent Operation Barbarossa in 1941 offered the Nazis new opportunities to isolate and concentrate Jews in remote regions. These areas, in their vision, could become massive confinement zones where Jews would be subjected to forced labor and extreme conditions. The creation of ghettos in cities such as Warsaw, Lodz, and Lublin was one of the first steps of this plan. The Nazis relocated Jewish communities from their towns and enclosed them in walled urban areas. These overcrowded zones with scarce resources functioned as concentration centers prior to future deportations. For Nazi authorities, the ghettos were a temporary solution while the final destination of the Jews was being defined. By mid-1941, projects were discussed to send Jews to uninhabited areas of the Soviet Union, especially Siberia. These proposals were based on the idea of using the vast eastern territories to establish forced labor colonies. However, logistical difficulties and the scale of the operation made such plans unfeasible. The war on the Eastern Front absorbed transport resources and hindered any attempt at long-distance mass deportation. The Ministry for the Eastern Territories, led by Alfred Rosenberg, was one of the bodies that pushed these projects. Rosenberg proposed that, in response to the Soviet deportations of Volga Germans, the Nazis could deport millions of Jews deep into Russia. This idea was brought to Hitler's headquarters in September 1941. Although Hitler showed interest, the plan remained theoretical, as there were no immediate conditions to implement it. Adolf Eichmann, responsible for the logistics of deportations, acknowledged in internal discussions that there was no capacity to house German Jews in the occupied territories. This lack of infrastructure, along with pressure from local authorities, led to consideration of more radical measures. Eichmann even suggested direct executions as a quick solution, reflecting the climate of brutality that was beginning to dominate Nazi circles. Transit camps in Poland, such as Chelmno and Belzec, emerged as a response to the need to manage deportations. These places initially functioned as gathering points but soon turned into extermination centers. The failure of the territorial plans in Siberia or Inner Russia led Nazi authorities to adopt far more violent measures to reduce the Jewish population. Nazi policy in the East combined deportation, confinement, and extermination. In Polish cities, Jews were confined in ghettos where hunger and disease caused thousands of deaths each month. The Nazis viewed these deaths as a natural consequence of their segregation policies and made no effort to alleviate the suffering. Meanwhile, the Einsatzgruppen, mobile SS units, advanced behind the German army in the Soviet Union. These units executed entire Jewish communities in mass graves under the pretext of security operations. The Babi Yar massacre in September 1941, where more than 30,000 people were killed in 2 days, is a clear example of this shift toward genocide. As the war progressed, the Nazis realized that a territorial solution was not practical. The vast distances, Soviet resistance, and lack of resources made it impossible to deport millions of Jews deep into Asia. This reality led to the creation of a more organized system of extermination, which would culminate in the so-called final solution. The failure of deportation projects towards Siberia coincided with the planning of key conferences, such as the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, where the plan for systematic extermination was formalized. By then, the idea of relocating Jews to remote territories had been replaced by the construction of extermination camps such as Auschwitz, Sobibor, and Treblinka. These camps were not mere places of confinement, but facilities designed for industrial-scale killing. Gas chambers and crematoriums became the primary method for carrying out the genocide. The earlier experiences with ghettos and transit camps had served as a grim rehearsal for this macabre system. From social exclusion to extermination, the ideological shift and Himmler's role. As the war progressed, the Nazis realized that a territorial solution was impractical. The distances, Soviet resistance, and lack of resources made it impossible to deport millions of Jews to Inner Asia. This reality led to the creation of a more organized extermination system, which would culminate in the so-called final solution. The failure of the deportation projects to Siberia coincided with the planning of key conferences such as the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, where the plan for systematic extermination was formalized. By then, the idea of relocating Jews to remote territories had been replaced by the construction of extermination camps such as Auschwitz, Sobibor, and Treblinka. These camps were not mere places of confinement, but centers designed to kill on an industrial scale. Gas chambers and crematoria became the main method of carrying out the genocide. The earlier experiences with ghettos and transit camps had served as a rehearsal for this macabre system. The Nazi anti-Jewish policy shifted from exclusion to a planned extermination system between 1939 and 1941. During this period, the regime radicalized its decisions, abandoning territorial and emigration solutions in favor of the physical elimination of millions. This change did not occur suddenly, but rather as the result of an escalation driven by the war and by leaders such as Heinrich Himmler, who became the main architect of the final solution. From the beginning, Hitler had made it clear that the Jewish question required a final solution. His speeches were deliberately vague, but those around him understood the message. Himmler, head of the SS, interpreted these signals and advanced in the most radical direction possible. While other leaders explored alternatives like deportation, Himmler designed a system that combined slave labor, mass deportations, and executions. His role was central in transforming Nazi policies into organized genocide. The relationship between Hitler and Himmler was close and direct. Every major proposal on population and deportation required Hitler's approval, but it was Himmler who drafted the concrete plans. Memoranda, such as the one from May 1940 regarding the treatment of Eastern populations, revealed his obsession with total racial cleansing. Hitler described the document as very correct, giving the green light to more aggressive operations. The euphoria from military victories in Poland and France accelerated radicalization. Himmler saw the war as an opportunity to implement his ideas without restrictions. In this context, the plan to deport Jews to Madagascar was considered viable, but when it failed, Himmler quickly proposed more direct methods. For him, the war in the East represented an open field to pacify territories through the physical elimination of entire populations. In the occupied Soviet territories, Himmler deployed special units such as the Einsatzgruppen. These groups, initially responsible for security tasks, soon carried out mass shootings. Himmler reinforced these units with SS brigades and police battalions, increasing their killing capacity. In the summer of 1941 alone, operations in Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states left tens of thousands of victims executed in mass graves. Hitler's increasingly violent rhetoric encouraged these actions. He did not issue explicit orders, but his insistence on the need to eliminate the enemy was interpreted as authorization for extermination. Himmler, leading the SS, embraced this task with fanaticism. His visits to battlefronts and concentration camps confirmed his direct involvement in the mass killings. In places like Bialystok, his presence coincided with large-scale massacres. The ideological transition was solidified with the creation of extermination camps in occupied Poland. Facilities like Chelmno, Belzec, and Sobibor were designed not for forced labor, but for systematic annihilation. Himmler personally oversaw the development of these centers, where more efficient methods were tested, such as the use of gas vans and sealed chambers. The shift in policies was also evident in the administration of the ghettos. These places, originally conceived as zones of confinement, were transformed into centers of slow death. Hunger, disease, and lack of resources reduced the population, while deportations to extermination camps were being prepared. Himmler viewed the ghettos as a transitional phase before total elimination. The Wannsee Conference in January 1942 formalized what was already being carried out on the ground. Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich presented a coordinated plan to deport and murder 11 million European Jews. Although Hitler was not present, his approval was implicit. Wannsee was the administrative confirmation of the final solution. At this point, Himmler's power was immense. He controlled the SS, the Gestapo, and the concentration camp network. Under his command, the Nazi system was entirely directed toward genocide. Each deportation, each execution was part of a precisely managed machine. His ability to turn ideology into action was key to the Holocaust. The war in the East, with its extreme brutality, served as a testing ground for extermination techniques. Mass shootings like Babi Yar in September 1941, where over 30,000 people were murdered in 2 days, demonstrated the scale of violence. Himmler personally oversaw some of these operations, giving instructions and ensuring that the methods were effective. In this context, the initial social exclusion, laws, boycotts, ghettos, transformed into a total extermination program. The transition was not only administrative but ideological. For Himmler and other Nazi leaders, expelling or isolating Jews was no longer enough. They had to be physically eliminated to fulfill the vision of an Aryan Europe. By the end of 1941, the decision was already consolidated. The Nazi high command stopped talking about expulsions and began coordinating a mass extermination plan. Trains full of Jews moved eastward with routes that appeared ordinary but whose destination was death. Local authorities received direct orders from Berlin, while facilities were built and expanded with one goal: to eliminate lives systematically. In January 1942, in a villa in Wannsee near Berlin, a decisive meeting was held. Reinhard Heydrich and Adolf Eichmann presented a precise scheme of the final solution. Each region had to submit lists, organize trains, and send contingents to the camps. The language used was cold and bureaucratic. The discussion was not about whether it should be done, but how to carry it out more efficiently. That table brought together civil officials, SS members, and government representatives. Figures, methods, and transport routes were detailed as if it were a routine logistical project. From that moment on, concentration camps were transformed into extermination centers. Auschwitz became the core of this system. Crematoria were built and gas chambers were perfected. Sobibor, Treblinka, Belzec and Majdanek followed the same model. Railway lines led directly to ramps where prisoners were divided between those who could be exploited for forced labor and those who would be killed immediately. The gas chambers were disguised as showers. New arrivals were led to believe they were going to be disinfected. Their belongings were taken, they were forced to undress, and then guided in groups. Once the doors were closed, lethal gases like Zyklon B were released. The process lasted only minutes, after which the bodies were dragged out by the Sonderkommandos, prisoners forced to operate the machinery of death. The crematoria worked day and night to erase all traces. The ashes were thrown into rivers, fields, or mass graves. The numbers increased week after week. Eichmann oversaw the transports, demanding punctuality and coordination. Each train was a timed operation. SS officers measured the efficiency of the camps by the number of people killed each day. Methods were implemented to speed up the processes, from expanding ovens to using excavators to dig massive pits. Everything was oriented toward industrial extermination. German companies participated in this chain. Firms like Krupp, IG Farben, and others used slave labor in factories near the camps. Prisoners were exploited until they died from starvation, exhaustion, or disease. These industries profited from contracts and supplies obtained through the looting of deportees' confiscated belongings. The trains arrived loaded with clothing, jewelry, and personal items that were then sorted, resold, or sent to Germany. The churches, with few exceptions, remained silent. Some priests or pastors timidly denounced what was happening, but most preferred not to intervene. Nazi propaganda controlled the media, and any dissenting voice was eliminated. Local authorities, bureaucrats, and railway workers knew the trains were heading toward death, yet fear, indifference, or complicity made the system run without interruption. In villages near the camps, residents saw the constant smoke from the crematoria. Some whispered rumors of killings, others tried not to look. The propaganda machine insisted they were labor camps. However, the odors, the traffic of trains, and the stories of escaped survivors revealed the truth. By the time the war turned against Germany, millions had already been murdered. The Wannsee Conference was followed by increasingly radical orders. Jews from France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Greece, Italy, and other occupied countries were deported en masse. In Warsaw, the ghetto was emptied through brutal roundups. The SS and Gestapo used deception to gather thousands of people at train stations. They were told they would be resettled, but their destination was Treblinka or Auschwitz. Operations were carried out with military precision. Each wagon was calculated to hold hundreds of people crammed together without water or ventilation. Many died during the journey from hunger, thirst, or suffocation. The extermination became an open secret. The Polish, French, and Czech resistance managed to obtain reports of what was happening. As early as 1942, diplomats and journalists began receiving coded messages about the killings. Some Allied governments became aware, but the information was so extreme that many doubted its veracity. The scale of the crime seemed unbelievable. Meanwhile, Nazi authorities began planning how to hide the evidence. In 1944, as the Red Army approached, the SS destroyed documents, dismantled crematoria, and executed witnesses. The death marches were the last attempt to empty the camps. Thousands of prisoners were forced to walk for days in the middle of winter. Those who collapsed were executed on the spot. Even so, the Soviets found remains of gas chambers, ovens, and pits with thousands of corpses. The testimonies of survivors confirmed every detail. They described the deceit of the fake showers, the selections on the ramps, the beatings, and the medical experiments. Doctors like Josef Mengele took advantage of the system to carry out atrocious experiments. Prisoners were treated as lab objects, exposed to infections, mutilations, or chemical tests without anesthesia. Every fact revealed after the war reinforced the magnitude of the genocide. The German population, for the most part, had perceived signs. Trains departed full and returned empty. Factories received used clothing in unimaginable quantities. Letters from soldiers serving in the East spoke of mass shootings. However, the official narrative and fear of the regime led many to remain silent. This collective silence allowed the machinery to continue operating without internal resistance. At the Nuremberg trials, Nazi leaders tried to deny or minimize the facts. but the evidence was overwhelming. Photographs, documents, remnants of facilities, and testimonies from captured officers demonstrated the extermination's planning. Eichmann, captured years later, admitted that his job was to coordinate trains to send millions of people to death. He did it with the same logic used to manage a transport system, without remorse. Looting was another central element. From jewelry to gold teeth, everything was extracted from the bodies. The SS had units dedicated to sorting and melting the gold recovered from victims. This loot was sent to the Reichsbank to finance the war effort. The warehouses at Auschwitz, known as Canada, were filled with personal belongings. This plundering, combined with slave labor, turned extermination into a business as macabre as it was profitable. Brutality became routine. Camp guards were trained to dehumanize prisoners. Every blow, insult, and humiliation was part of a system designed to break the victim's will. Some prisoners attempted to rebel, as happened in Sobibor and Treblinka, where organized escapes took place. These actions showed that, even in extreme conditions, resistance existed. The end came with the Allied advance in 1945. The camps were liberated one by one, revealing unimaginable scenes: piles of corpses, skeletal prisoners, warehouses full of stolen items. The gas chambers and crematoria were direct evidence of what had happened. The images captured by Allied soldiers spread worldwide, exposing the scale of the crime. This extermination process was planned from the offices of power but carried out by thousands of hands. Guards, bureaucrats, railway workers, businessmen, doctors, and neighbors contributed directly or indirectly to the machinery of death. The genocide was not the work of a few, but of a complete structure that operated with efficiency. By the end of the war, it was clear that the extermination of the Jewish people was not only the work of those who executed it directly, but also of those who allowed it through inaction.